Okay? Now, how to make this all operational? Well, let's discuss number 3 here. In terms of the external physical boundary, actually, well, let me talk about how to do it. The first thing you need to do when you're establishing boundaries and really going to make them operational is be sure you always begin with the physical external boundary. That's the first one you want to work on. And that is because your internal boundary will not work if your external physical is not in place. So when you think about starting it up, remember it's my recommendation that you begin with the external physical boundary. Then you can move to your external sexual or your internal boundary. Okay? Now, some people are incest survivors or survivors of rape or sexual molestation, and maybe at a point in their recovering process where they haven't done sufficient detoxification work from their sexual abuse. And so they're at a period of time when they're using a sexual wall and not trying to negotiate sexual experience. And if that's the case for some of you, it's important not to try to make your external sexual operational. You have to go according to what your therapist or your counselor is telling you. But if you're not at a point in your life when you can really have the ability yet to negotiate that, then what you do is you set up your external physical, then move to creating your internal. If you have a sexual partner and there aren't any sexual problems, then you move from the external physical to the external sexual to the internal. Okay? Okay, how to create that external physical is very simple. What you first start doing is controlling all aspects of physical touching and distance with others as they approach you. In other words, what you do is you put energy into pushing that external physical energy at somebody and controlling how close they stand to you and whether they get to touch you or not. That's the first thing you do. When you get used to that, then the next thing you do is you move into allowing others to control how close you get to stand to them and whether you get to touch them or not. So you first concentrate on another's aspect with you about, how close they're going to get to you and whether they get to touch you or not, and then you can shift your focus on to thinking about as you approach somebody, how close you're getting to them, and making sure that you ask permission before you touch them if you want to touch them or hug them, that sort of thing. Now the thing is, I want you to remember, as you're learning how to do the second part of this, allowing others to control how close you get to them and whether you get to touch them or not, I want you to remember that in our culture, people normally don't want another to stand any closer than 18 inches. And some people need as much as 24 inches or more. So what I tell people to do when they're first beginning to practice this external boundary is to stand about 24 inches or a couple of feet away from people and don't get any closer than that. It'll give you greater sensitivity about how to negotiate how close you get to stand to somebody. Now, of course, what you do when you're concentrated on the second part of this is you pay attention to you begin to pay attention to what people are doing as you're approaching. When you see people lean away from you or start backing away, what you want to do is stop, not keep moving towards them. So you can see when you set this external physical boundary into motion, there's two parts to it. Start with one and then start concentrating on the other and then do them both at once. Okay? Some people say, well, how long is that going to take? I don't know. Some people manage to do it in a couple hours. Some people I've seen take as long as 6 months. It takes what it takes. Okay? Setting the external sexual boundary is much the same thing. What you do is you start controlling all aspects of sexual experience as others approach you. That's the first thing you do. And that means that you are into conscious thinking about who, when, where, and how. Start off with who, if you can't do the when, where, and how. Then move to the when, or the where, or the how. You can take them one at a time if it's a real difficult boundary, but start with who. Okay? Then as you do that and get comfortable with that, then switch to the other part and start concentrating on how important it is for you to let another person determine who, when, where, and how with you. In other words, it's learning to accept the no from another without taking it personally And it's about learning to negotiate when, where, and how. Now, let me talk to you just a moment about negotiation. Negotiating something is a process, and I've been mentioning it, so I want to kind of go through it very quickly so you have some idea what I mean about negotiation. When you're negotiating something, why you have to negotiate is that there's conflict going on. The first thing you want to do when you're negotiating something is to have both people recognize there's a conflict, and then each person speak to all the solutions that could be found that would be acceptable to them. So one person speaks and the other person speaks about the solutions, and then together you decide among all those solutions what will be one that you both could agree to, and then you do it. That's negotiation. Okay? Now, what I want to do now is to go back to the internal boundary and discuss how to do this. Now, this is the hardest one of all to do. And it is done by following this procedure. And I'm going to have Bill and Corky demonstrate this in a minute. So I want you guys to pay particular attention to this. Now, before you can use your internal boundary, you've got to get your external boundary set up with somebody who's going to confront you or who you're going to share with. And you will see me do that with Bill and Corky. The second thing that you have to do if you're on the receiving end of a confrontation is work this business out. Here, now. What this is about is this, that what's going to happen here is Corky's going to confront Bill about something. Bill doesn't even know what it is yet. It's something Corky and I kind of cooked up. And what's going to happen is Corky's going to be in this position where she's going to share something with Bill. Bill, you might want to really carefully look at this because you're going to have to do this, okay? When Corky confronts Bill, and Bill's going to use his internal boundary, what he has to do is, first of all, say to himself, this is about Corky, not about me. All she's doing is sharing her reality with me. And it's about Corky more than it is about me. I don't have to be responsible for it. On the other hand, I have to listen to see if it's a boundary violation. If it is, I need to make an amends. Other than that, all I have to do is really listen. But the second thing that Bill has to do as he's listening is to determine if what Corky is telling him is true, not true, or questionable. So what is Bill doing now as he's using his internal boundary with Corky, because Corky is sending her reality at him? What he basically is doing is using his own brain to determine whether he's going to stop something from coming in or whether he's going to let it in. You see that? Now, if his brain says what Corky is saying is true, then what he is to do is filter it through his external boundary, filter it through the internal boundary, and feel about it. If he determines what Corky is saying is not true, that he didn't do it or he didn't believe in what she's saying, he is to block it at the external boundary, let it fall on the floor, and notice that's who Corky is and that she's made that up. And isn't that interesting? I don't even believe what she's telling me. If he determines I can't figure out whether this is true or not, what he is to do is filter it through the external boundary, block it at the internal boundary, not take it in, and go back and get more data about the situation so he can eventually move it from questionable to not true or questionable to true. Now, if he gets more data, he needs to gather the data in a very specific way. And I would write this down. It's not up here. When you go to gather the data, when you come up with questionable as you're receiving that incoming reality, you need to be sure that you do that in 4 sentences or less without blaming the other person, without complaining or whining, and without explaining yourself, which means you put a because in that sentence. Okay? Then if the data moves it to not true, what Bill would do would be to throw it out. If the data moves it to true, then what Bill will do is haul it off his shoulder, take it through his gut, and feel about it. If he asks for the data and he still can't move off questionable, then he holds it on his shoulder and maybe waits waits until he gets the data he needs to make that determination. Sometimes moving from questionable to true or not true takes years. Sometimes it's just instantly. Sometimes it's hours. Sometimes it's a week. Sometimes it's a month. It will really vary between when you will move something to questionable to not true or true. That's how you use your internal boundary here when you're on the receiving end. What he says, when he says, this is about Corky, not about me, she is just sharing herself with me and I need to be here to listen. He's putting the energy out here. He's putting that boundary right here. And essentially with that, he's stopping the data coming at him with that first statement. And then he goes into this, true, not true, or questionable, so he can decide whether to let that in or keep it out. Can you see how that makes it measured vulnerability? And he's the one that determines what he lets get to him based on whether it's the truth for him or not. Can you see that? Now, Corky's part of using an internal boundary is simply to say to herself, I have created this reality and I'm here sharing who I am with him. He is not responsible for this. However, she can also say to herself that if it is a boundary violation, she has the right to expect an amends. However, whether he gives it or not needs to become none of her business. Okay? So I'm going to have Corky and Bill come up right now and go ahead and demonstrate how to do this. Okay? And again, what they're going to be doing is Bill's going to be doing this, blocking it and figuring out whether it's true, not true, or questionable, and Corky simply is going to share it. Go ahead, Corky. Now, one of the things Corky needs to do as she confronts Bill is to do the confrontation. Go ahead and get knee to knee. Go ahead and do the confrontation. Now, Corky, I want you to pay attention to this. When you confront him, I want you to do it in 4 sentences or less, without blaming him, making him wrong, without whining or complaining, or without putting a because in there and explaining yourself, okay? So Corky has some rules to follow over here, too, all right? Now, we'll start with what? What's the first thing we should start with here? What was the first thing I told you? Yes, they need to set an external boundary with each other. Now, I usually have the person on the receiving end of the confrontation establish where they want to be, because generally speaking, they need more room. So, Bill, what I want you to do, and set your external boundary with her, by looking her in the eyes and saying to yourself, she's going to confront him. How far back do I need to get in order to hear it? Without, if you're too close, it's going to smack you in the face. If it's too far away, you can't hear her. So start moving back, and when you think you're in the right place, to have enough space to push energy against her and stop it so that you can determine true, not true, or questionable, then stop your chair. So start moving back and think about that. Keep looking at her now as you move back. You guys can do this if you're sitting confronting each other, do it. If you're standing in the kitchen, get the distance before you confront somebody, okay? About like that. Now remember, you're going to have to put energy out here and block what she's saying and think to yourself, is this true, not true, or questionable? And the distance is about having enough space here. Is that about right for you? Okay, Corky, now, you too need to set an external boundary with him. The thing is, whoever needs the greatest distance gets the distance. So would you rather be further back or closer to Bill? Okay, so then you need to stay put, because he needs the distance, right? Okay, now, so what I want you to do is think about what you're going to confront him about and try to do it in 4 sentences or less. Without, watch your tone of voice. I mean, don't say because, and don't make him wrong. Okay, so can you figure out how to do that? You know what you're going to say? Okay, so it goes like this. Bill, this is what I saw you do. About that I feel, and I prefer you to do this next time. Okay? Make it a prefer, because you don't have a right to control him.
I felt a lot of pain last night when I was under the impression you would come home from the party in approximately an hour.
Okay, that's 1 sentence.
And I didn't receive a phone call or word that you would be late, and I would prefer that you do that.
Okay, now that's 3 sentences. Okay? But in saying that, it would be really hard to know what you're talking about. Okay? There was a lot. Now, Bill probably knows about this. I mean, he probably knows about more circumstances, you know. But still, it would be, if I were listening to that and was a little confused or really defensive, I'd have a hard time knowing exactly what you said, what you were really talking about. Here would be probably a more succinct confrontation. Bill, last night when you went to that wedding, you promised to be home in an hour. You were not. And when you didn't come home and you didn't call me that you were going to be late, I felt a lot of anger and pain. In the future, I prefer you to call me when you're going to be late. You see how that's more specific? Okay, can you do it again? I know it's hard to do it in front of cameras. I always love my friends to be tortured just as bad as I am. Okay, think about it now. Be more specific and don't start with your feelings. I felt hurt, da-da-da-da-da. Don't start that way. Start by describing his behavior. Bill, last night you.
Bill, last night, when you went to the wedding and stayed gone until 12 o'clock, I was under the impression you would be home earlier, within an hour, and I felt a lot of pain and anger when you didn't come home.